Motorsport seems like it would be pretty difficult to fix. With countless drivers from different teams and diverse backgrounds, it would be a massive challenge to get everyone in agreement about one particular driver who would take both the victory and the overall prize money. But for decades, historians have been led to believe a race-fixing scandal is exactly what happened at the 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix. Shocking, right? Well, not quite. The race-fixing allegations that have become part of early Grand Prix lore might have been completely made up by a man who wasn't even at the event. Today, we're going to attempt to uncover the truth. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. If you're a longtime racing fan, then you probably know how grim the motorsport apparel scene can be. I don't know about you, but I have never once even been minorly compelled to buy one of those F1 Team Kit-esque polos that make you look more like an employee than a fan. I want something interesting, something that makes a statement, not just about my interests, but about my fashion sense. That's why this season, Deadly Passions Terrible Joys is partnering with Home Field Apparel, a vintage-style sports-centric clothing company based in Indiana. Homefield is looking to expand into the racing world this year, which means they're a great partnership for me. To celebrate the 2024 Daytona 500, Homefield's first drop will be appropriately NASCAR themed. Make sure you check out the link in my bio to get your hands on a new fit of your own. For many modern race fans, the early 1930s motorsport scene can seem like a whole new world. So before we delve into this particular tale of race-fixing intrigue, I want to make sure we set the scene. Before World War II, the concept of a professional racer was kind of unheard of. Motorsport's origins are largely traced back to wealthy individuals who got their kicks from spending money on an expensive car and either racing it themselves or giving it over to a more skilled driver. However, prize purses at the time were fairly small. The real moneymaker was appearance fees. Basically, if a track wanted a high-profile driver to show up at their event, they'd entice him with the promise that he'd be paid just for being there. In an era where reliability issues often prevented even the greatest drivers from finishing an event, starting fees were critical. Prize money was just an added bonus, and anything else you could eke out of a race weekend was a blessing. But what if there just so happened to be a race where there wasn't just prize and starting money? What if there was a massive lottery, too? One that could net a lucky fan an additional sum? And what if that fan wanted to ensure that their driver would win? Surely that would encourage even more racers to turn up, to put on a good show, maybe to engage in a little tomfoolery. That is essentially what happened at the 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix. But let's back it up one more time to really understand how European motorsport found a foothold in Africa. Pre-war European motorsport was a very nationalistic affair. This was an era where cars were painted in the national colors of the teams that entered them. So that's why Italian entries like Alfa Romeo or Ferrari were both painted red, and why British teams were regularly painted a deep forest green. Anytime a race was playing out, you weren't just watching the skills of the drivers. You were also paying careful attention to the design and construction of each country's cars. Races were races, but they were also displays of national wealth, national industrial priorities, national technological innovations, and more. Plus, as the fervor for speed grew, racing also naturally became a great method of promoting tourism. A whole industry started to grow around these events, and the countries that were involved began to look beyond the confines of their own borders when it came to staging races. It's the same idea that would later encourage Cuba to host a race in Havana, a race that resulted in the kidnapping of Juan Manuel Fangio, which you can hear about in the first episode of Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. It's also the mindset that gave us racing in Libya. Between 1911 and 1912, the Kingdom of Italy engaged in a war against the Ottoman Empire, the latter of which had control over a significant portion of Southeast Europe, West Asia, and North Africa. That included Libya, one of the North African states that border the Mediterranean Sea. Italy, though, claimed it was actually the rightful owner of Libya, and in 1911, it really ramped up its efforts to colonize the African state. The Italo-Turkish War ended when Ottoman Turkey surrendered its control of Libya to Italian forces in 1912. Those Italian forces immediately responded by trying to subjugate the populations of two Libyan colonies, Tripolitania and Cyrenaica. This led to a period of serious tension. As you can imagine, folks who had been living in contested territories like Tripolitania and Cyrenaica did not want to follow the harsh rule of the Italian colonizers. They kicked off their own resistance movement, and in response, the occupying fascist Italian forces waged a massive pacification campaign. They utilized chemical weapons, concentration camps, and mass executions to keep the colonized territory in line. Italian forces committed ethnic cleansing. They killed off local livestock, and they watched thousands of people die off thanks to the unsanitary conditions of their concentration camps. After 2 decades, a quarter of Cyrenaica's population had been killed. Despite its widespread terror campaign, Italy still wanted to utilize Libya to its fullest potential. Libya needed to find ways to pay its occupiers, and Italy wanted to earn more income by transforming the country into a tourist destination, perhaps one where tourists would decide to ultimately settle. What better way to encourage travel than with a race? There isn't really a ton of information about the initial Tripoli circuit. Motorsport magazine cites its first in 1925 as being 44.18 miles long, only for the track to be shortened to 16.28 miles the following year. There's really only a very rough layout of the track available and no indication of where the start-finish line was, nor the direction in which the race was run. We do know that those first events were organized by the colony's governor, General Emilio de Bono, and we know that the first few runnings were also something of a hot mess. Racers, fans, and tourists alike did take initial interest in the Tripoli Grand Prix, but ultimately the races were financial failures. The 1929 race only managed to take place because General de Bono personally fought for it. But in 1930, it seemed as if Tripoli was doomed. Only 12 cars turned up to compete at the Grand Prix. Fans were nowhere to be found. Then, promising driver Gaston Brilli-Peri was killed after crashing heavily on a poorly paved left-handed bend. Brilli-Peri hit an embankment and was ejected from his vehicle. The fallout from that death meant the 1931 race was canceled, and there was very little motivation to revive the event in 1932. By this time, though, Tripoli had actually begun to attract more interested tourists and residents, and it even had its own auto club. Egidio Sforzini, the president of that club, decided now was a great time to try again. While the initial Tripoli Grand Prix were held on a street circuit, Sforzini decided that what the event truly needed was a purpose-built European-style track, effectively a state-of-the-art course that would serve as a much more attractive prospect for drivers and fans than a roughshod public road. He gained the support of De Bono, who chose to offer his full backing to Sforzini in the creation of Tripoli's new Malhala Lake track. Paired with the support of then-Governor De Bono, Tripoli was set to become a mainstay on the yearly motorsport calendar. The new 8.165-mile permanent track was built in a salt basin near the Malhala Air Base, and it was a marvel of a circuit. Its most eye-catching feature was a brilliant white concrete tower constructed across from the front stretch grandstands. Those grandstands could hold 10,000 people. Some grandstands included cantilevered roofs, while the rest of the track was decorated with formal gardens and cut stone landscaping. On top of that, the track had ample start line lighting, a state-of-the-art photoelectric timing system, and an anticipated top speed of over 200 miles per hour. If you were a motorsport fan, the Valhalla track had become a must-see spectacle. Then, in 1933, after 2 years without a race, Tripoli was once again set to host a Grand Prix. But into that promising start came a very compelling concept from an Italian auto journalist. Rather than just host a mere race, why not turn the whole thing into a lottery? In 1930, as a way to raise money for local state hospitals, Ireland introduced something called the Irish Sweepstakes. In it, people would purchase a lottery ticket, and their stub was then drawn from a barrel and matched to the name of a horse running in a major Irish or British race. If one of those horses won, the ticket holder would earn a handsome prize. But of course, a significant portion of the ticket earnings ended up lining the pockets of sweepstakes organizers. Italian journalist Giovanni Canestrini had an idea. The 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix should host its very own lottery, modeled after the Irish sweepstakes. Canestrini, though, wasn't just any old journalist. He was the editor of La Gazzetta dello Sport, which was the most popular sporting magazine in Italy. He had close ties to many Italian racing magnates, men like Enzo Ferrari, who was known to pawn off particularly juicy scoops just to Canestrini in exchange for certain favors, such as perhaps Canestrini reporting on a total rumor in order to force an automaker to reach out to Enzo and offer favorable financial and technical support. When Canestrini pitched the idea of the sweepstakes, then plenty of people were listening. First, Canestrini took the idea to Governor Emilio de Bono. The two men were old friends from the Great War, and that only helped de Bono give his approval to the idea. However, because Libya was an Italian colony, they needed many more seals of approval before any lottery could actually take place. De Bono pushed the idea up the ranks, and soon after, Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini himself declared the idea a favorable one. Then, in August of 1932, the idea received the official go-ahead when Italy's King Vittorio Emanuele III authorized the lottery via Royal Decree 1147. The Lottery de Milioni became the official name of the lottery, which accompanied the race, the Corsa de Milioni. Lottery tickets first went on sale in October of 1932 for a very small fee, somewhere between 11 and 15 Italian lira. Consulting the historic exchange rates, in 1933, $1 US was equivalent to about 15 lira. Converted into today's currency, that would be about $25 per ticket. Not a bad deal, and the prize purse was huge. The lottery worked like this. Anyone in Italy could buy a ticket. Then, 8 days before the race organizers, supervised by Governor Pietro Badoglio, would draw 30 tickets. They'd then put those tickets back and draw them again in order to assign them to the 30 starters of the race. If your driver won the race, you would earn 3 million lira. If your driver took second, you'd get 2 million. If your driver was third, you'd get 1 million. Everyone else was just out of luck. It's a little tough to know exactly how much money was raised, but Canestrini claims it was around 15 million lira. He says that 6 million was set aside for the prizes, though the exact figures that were given out as prizes are a little hard to pin down. Another 1.2 million went to the Automotive Club of Tripoli, and 550,000 lira was reserved for starting and prize money, which, at that time, was pretty generous. That leaves about half of the 15 million lira unaccounted for, but many sources I reference simply presume the missing funds were channeled into the pockets of key Italian personnel. With 8 days between the ticket drawing and the race, all 30 lottery contestants were notified by telegram. 8 days is a long time, but was it long enough to commit an international motorsport scandal? For decades, many people believed that to be the case. covered our bases, let's really look into the Tripoli fixing allegations that motorsport enthusiasts have been led to believe for decades, and figure out why there are several different versions of this story that get passed around. If you've ever tried to find the source of a rumor, then you know it's really difficult to figure out exactly where that story got started. In our case, though, it's actually pretty simple. The first real documented rehashing of this Tripoli story came from Alfred Neubauer's ghostwritten autobiography titled Speed Was My Life. One chapter, titled The Race That Was Rigged, has been cited by almost everyone who has ever talked about Tripoli. At first glance, that seems like a pretty reputable source. Neubauer served as a racing manager for the Mercedes-Benz team from 1926 to 1955, and he was essentially the godfather of all of those ultra-efficient in-race procedures that transformed motorsport from an amateur affair to a professional one. Neubauer is the guy who invented a complex signal system of flags and pit boards to give his drivers information during races. He was also one of the first people to prepare detailed travel dossiers for his drivers before they traveled to a foreign country. That way, if a European was taking his first trip to Mexico, he'd know how to access clean drinking water, what diseases he could catch, and where he should eat to be in top racing form. Basically, all of that is to say that if Neubauer were to tell you something, or perhaps to write it in his autobiography, you'd probably be foolish for not believing it. For years, people did believe Neubauer's story. As he tells it, the scandalous tale of the 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix really began when Giovanni Canestrini, the editor of Gazzetta dello Sport, reached out to Enrico Rivio, a lumber merchant whose ticket had been matched with that of racer Achille Varzi. Neubauer claims that Canestrini organized a deal. If Varzi won, then Rivio would split his prize money equally between himself and the racer. Somehow, several other drivers got involved in the mess. Tazio Nuvolari, Baccanin Borzicchini, Giuseppe Campari, and Louis Chiron. Allegedly, these were men that Varzi could count on to help assure his victory. As a result, Varzi would split his half of the winnings equally amongst his confidants, thus assuring the drivers would get a heftier prize purse than they were already receiving. As for what Canestrini would get out of the whole thing, Neubauer never mentioned it. Neubauer's account also leaves out any logic as to why Varzi was chosen to be the winner, but according to Brock Yates, the author of the Enzo Ferrari biography titled The Man, the Cars, the Races, the Machine, there were two reasons. First, Varzi was behind the wheel of a Bugatti Type 51, which was assumed to be the most dominant car on the grid, regardless of whether or not the race was fixed. Second, a victory by a French car was supposed to eliminate suspicion of a totally Italian-dominated fix. Crucially, Yates pinpoints two other parties who may or may not have been involved. First was Enzo Ferrari. Because so many of the drivers involved in the fix were members of Ferrari's team, Yates suggests that it's highly likely Ferrari knew something of the fix, but he was never able to find concrete proof that that was the case. Further, Yates also makes a point of noting that English driver Sir Henry Tim Birkin was pointedly not involved, either because he was morally opposed to the whole ordeal or because his competitors didn't really even view him as a threat. The biggest challenge to Varzi's alleged dominance campaign was supposed to be qualifying. The entries on the grid didn't line up in a qualifying order, they lined up in order of drawing of ballots, which meant the whole grid was shuffled. By the end of lap 1, something unexpected was happening. Tim Birkin had not only taken the lead, but he had begun to build an impressive gap over the pack duking it out behind him. Nuvolari sat in second, with Campari, Varzi, Luigi Fagioli, and Borzicchini all duking it out behind him. If you trust Neubauer's perspective, then Birkin was fast because the Italian drivers weren't keen on stressing out their cars. The Tripoli track was expected to be both fast and harsh in ways that were likely to damage the cars. Plus, just to throw another monkey wrench into the whole ordeal, Neubauer alleges that the men involved in the fixing scandal also had a hand in issuing a ridiculous pit stop rule that forbade more than one person from working on one car. That is, allegedly, because Italian drivers realized Birkin was much quicker in practice than he was supposed to be. Because the Maserati team had arrived with just one mechanic to service the two cars, and because that mechanic would automatically be assigned to Campari, Birkin was stuck with a local mechanic who turned out to be a drunk. Within a handful of the race's 30 laps, Neubauer's version of the story states that Varzy's car began to misfire. He had to pit to swap out spark plugs, but he also topped off with a little bit of fuel, enough to be able to take him to the end. On lap 14, Giuseppe Campari pulled in for a pit stop after having grabbed the lead. However, because Varzy was supposed to be the winner, Campari allegedly asked his mechanic to service his car so slowly as to be noticeable by the crowd. He was trying to kill as much time as possible to make sure that Varzy could get into the lead. At this point now, Nuvolari was said to be leading, followed by Borzacchini, Chiron, and Birkin. Once again, the alleged cruelty of the race fixers came into play when Birkin pulled into the pits to find his hired mechanic passed out drunk under a tree. Birkin was forced to get out of his car to change his own tires and fill his own gas tank, and in the process is said to have burned his arm on the Maserati's hot exhaust pipe. Now, don't forget that detail. That's going to be important later. During the pit stop process, Chiron also managed to lose a ton of time, but Nuvolari and Borzacchini were still in the top two positions as Varzy rocketed along behind them, desperate to catch up. On lap 27, 3 from the end, Borzacchini was reported to be looking back over his shoulder in a constant, desperate search for Varzy, and when he realized the chosen winner wasn't coming up quickly enough, Borzacchini made a decision. He chose to cut a corner too tight, hit the oil drum that was put in place to mark the corner, and burst a tire. He cruised back to the pits, where he retired. Finally, all that was left was Nuvolari's 20-second lead. But Varzy began to notice that his crazed pace had used up way too much fuel, and he was going to run out before the end. He slowed, and Nuvolari apparently carried on so quickly that he very nearly lapped Varzy. So Nuvolari did something ridiculous. He pulled into the pits for a stop that seemed to stretch on endlessly and have no purpose. He seemed to go all out afterward, trying to chase his competition, while Campari also retired, citing a loose fuel tank as a very questionable excuse. On the last lap, Neubauer's story gets even more absurd. As Varzy drastically slowed his pace to save fuel, Nuvolari was forced to pass his fellow Italian driver or else give up the whole plot. Varzy was able to switch on his Bugatti's reserve fuel tank soon after, but Nuvolari was still craning his neck and looking behind, trying to catch a glimpse of the chasing Varzy. Then, allegedly, Nuvolari did something ridiculous. He pulled to a stop on the final straight, claiming that he had run out of fuel. He screamed and screamed for his mechanic to slosh just a little bit more into the tank, after which point he got started again. But all that messing around had had its desired effect. Varzy cruised by to finish 0.2 seconds ahead of Nuvolari, while Birkin finished third. The race fixers had come out on top, and as if to further prove their guilt, Neubauer said that Varzy, Nuvolari, and Borzacchini were all spotted sipping expensive champagne in their hotel after the race. The morning after, Tripoli's sporting authority held a special session to claim that a certain selection of drivers had organized a fixing scandal, and that those drivers should not only be disqualified from the race, but should also have their competition licenses revoked. According to Neubauer, no one would dare fathom a world in which the greatest drivers in Europe had their licenses withdrawn. Instead, those drivers were merely given a warning, and the fixing scandal was tucked neatly away in the history books. Well, almost. One problem still remained in the form of Sir Tim Birkin. That burn he received on his exhaust pipe during the pit stop proved to be fatal. Birkin died a few months later after battling a long illness, perhaps a blood infection, that supposedly resulted from his contact with the hot pipe. Because Neubauer's recounting places so much emphasis on the race-fixing drivers forcing the change of rules that resulted in Birkin having to hire an ineffective mechanic, the implication is that those now rich drivers were entirely to blame for the death of a promising sportsman. They had pulled off their scheme, but it had cost a man his life. What Neubauer told was a really compelling story, one that reporters and authors and fans never thought they needed to question. Then, a gentleman named Don Capps came to set the record straight. A retired U.S. Army colonel who served in Vietnam, Capps went on to become a member of the Society of Automotive Historians, where he's given some impressive lectures about racing history. His specialty? Motorsport between the two world wars. Well, back in 2000, Don Capps read an article in Motorsport magazine called The Great Grand Prix Swindle, and he took to the Autosport forum to point out some discrepancies. The article is essentially a rehashing of the Neubauer crafted storyline, and when fellow forum users confronted Capps about the fact that he thought this was incorrect, Capps was able to point to an article he had written the year prior that rejected the common view that the 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix had been rigged. The commenters read what Capps wrote, and while they naturally challenged his sources, Capps was able to back everything up with a citation and a reason. 12 years later, Motorsport magazine finally righted that wrong. Citing Capps, journalist Doug Nye shares Neubauer's version of the much-debated Tripoli race and goes on to point out the evolution of various views of the event. As it turns out, writer Bill Boddy actually challenged the convenient Tripoli narrative in Motorsport back in 1969, but that did little to change the public opinion until Capps' interest was sparked by the recollections of a woman named Betty Sheldon in her husband's book, A Record of Grand Prix and Voiturette Racing, Volume 3. Slowly, a handful of dedicated researchers really began to piece together the truth of the Tripoli Grand Prix. First and foremost, I want to point out one initial discrepancy that I've noticed between the Capps and Neubauer version of the story. Neubauer alleges that journalist Canestrini went directly to Italo Balbo, the eventual governor of Tripoli, with his ideas about a lottery, and that it was Balbo who quickly passed that information on to Mussolini. If you check the facts, though, that wouldn't have been possible. The timelines don't add up. Balbo did not take over as Governor General until November 1933, well after the May 7th running of the Tripoli Grand Prix. As a result, he likely would not have had the authority to begin formulating the lottery plan, nor would he have been able to use the lottery as a way to establish his authority in Libya. Certainly not when the track construction and lottery idea were coming to fruition well before 1933. Perhaps a minor sticking point for some, but for me that's huge. If Neubauer actually managed to have an insider's perspective on the Tripoli lottery, then this would be a strange mistake to make. But it's only the first in a series of other errors that are embedded in the status quo. It means essentially that we need to hold Neubauer's story up to a more critical light. For the first 8 runnings, the Tripoli Grand Prix was primarily an Italian affair. Big budget teams like Maserati and Alfa Romeo turned up in spades, but there were plenty of French entrants like Bugatti and Talbot. Germany, though, didn't turn up at the event until 1935. At that point, Mercedes and Auto Union both proved to be forces to be reckoned with in the racing world, and they'd started to expand their horizons far beyond continental Europe in the hope of establishing their racing might. Because Germany's massive investment in its racing program also doubled as something of a metaphor for its military prowess, the country was quite interested in dominating teams of other nations, both at their home tracks and in their colonies. Of course, Germany would have had its finger on the pulse of international motorsport, but it seems particularly strange that a man like Alfred Neubauer would dedicate an entire chapter of his autobiography to a race he didn't even attend. Even if he had found a supposed race-fixing scandal and was fascinated enough by it to mention it, why should he give it so much time in a book about his life if he had no direct ties? I'm not sure we'll ever find a particularly satisfying answer to that question, but it does serve as a big red flag and a warning that not everything is as straightforward as it seems. And there's another, even bigger red flag. Go ahead and check the race results for the 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix, And you'll notice that one of the 5 alleged co-conspirators did not even enter the race. There is no official record anywhere that Louis Chiron competed in the 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix. He isn't listed in qualifying, he isn't listed as a race finisher, and he isn't mentioned anywhere in Motorsport magazine's race report, which ran in its June 1933 edition. That's especially wild to think about when you realize how highly Neubauer stressed the crawling pace of drivers like Varzi and Chiron. Shockingly, this fact remained obscure for years. Even Bill Bodie, who tore down Neubauer's fanciful claims back in 1969, did not question the assertion that Chiron was present. It just goes to show that once a certain narrative has become embedded in the cultural consciousness, it is extremely difficult to pry it out again. So we know one side of the story. Let's get back to our veteran Don Capps and the research he has done to establish the truth of the 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix. From what Capps has been able to unearth, he posits that on the actual day of the lottery drawing, Italian journalist Giovanni Canestrini conducted a meeting with 3 drivers, Tazio Nuvolari, Achille Varzi, and Beckham Borzacchini. This meeting took place during the Alessandria Grand Prix weekend, one of several major Italian races held in 1933. One source claims that Varzi says they only talked about their travel plans to Tripoli. Another source says that the drivers were already joined by their ticket holders, which would seem a little impossible. Canestrini, for his own part, says Varzi claimed the meeting was about the lottery. Whatever transpired at that first meeting in Alessandria is a bit of a moot point, because the real meeting began the following week in Rome. Nuvolari, Varzi, and Borzacchini joined Canestrini and the 3 ticket holders who had been assigned to those drivers. Canestrini is said to have mediated a conversation between the drivers and their ticket holders. Essentially, all 6 men agreed that in the event of one driver winning the race, all 6 men would equally split the prize funds. It's not totally clear how the lottery winners got involved. Some people suggest that Nuvolari told Canestrini to organize the group. Others suggest that Canestrini was the one who organized them of his own free will. Whatever the case, though, one thing is clear. The 6, as some began to call them, were not looking to fix the 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix. They were instead trying to, and I quote, find a formula which did not contravene the sporting rules. They wanted extra money, they wanted to divide that money amongst themselves, but they didn't want to break the rules to do it. Was it totally within the spirit of the regulations? No. But it also wasn't anywhere near illegal. It's also worth pointing out here that Achille Varzi's ticket holder wasn't actually a man named Enrico Rivio, as Neubauer told us. His ticket holder's name was Arduino Sampoli. Rivio wasn't even involved in this 6-man plan to share race winnings. That little plot also was not a huge secret. Canestrini wrote up an agreement that all 6 men signed, legally binding them to their word so that no one would suddenly decide to keep all of the lottery hoard to themselves at the last minute. The agreement was notarized and held at the Lavoro Bank in Rome. Again, what Canestrini got out of this whole deal is lost to time. The whole thing had become so publicized at this point that Enzo Ferrari apparently required Nuvolari to make a public statement that Ferrari himself was not at all involved in the arrangement, though it's not totally clear why he made that request. All of the big sporting magazines reported on this agreement between the 6. The drivers who weren't involved in the arrangement were also incredibly miffed. In fact, Giuseppe Campari, who was supposedly one of the co-conspirators according to Neubauer, and Tim Birkin were said to have made an agreement that they'd do everything they could to ruin the race for the so-called conspirators. Carlo Gazzabini, another racer in the event, turned down a similar offer from his lottery holder and even went so far as to make threats against the drivers involved. Apparently, Varzi's response to all of this drama was to say nothing but, "Do whatever you like, I will drive my own race." Now, there is one little sticking point. Canestrini claims that just before the race, Achille Varzi approached Tazio Nuvolari to hash out a few things. See, Varzi and Nuvolari had quite a rivalry over the years, and Varzi was afraid that in the heat of the battle, Nuvolari would forget all about their agreement and just try to take Varzi out, which would result in both of them losing money. Apparently, Canestrini was the one who decided to flip a coin to determine which of the two men should cross the line first. Varzi won the coin toss, and Nuvolari was said to have agreed to the terms. Borzacchini was not consulted. But it's also not clear that Canestrini's coin toss story holds any water. No one else has ever mentioned it, and like Neubauer, Canestrini did have a penchant for adding a little bit of flair to his stories. If it was true, it would absolutely constitute a race-fixing scandal, but not of the same nature that Neubauer claimed. And we also can't forget the Tripoli Grand Prix itself, the race that seemed so pointedly fixed in Varzi's direction. As you can imagine, it wasn't quite as Neubauer told it either. Tim Birkin did indeed the initial part of the first lap, but Campari quickly overtook him. Luigi Fagioli stopped for a spark plug change, and Varzi had to nurse his Bugatti around the Valhalla circuit because his mechanics had overfilled his oil sump. That put one of his engine's 8 cylinders out of commission, at least until the oil burnt off. Campari's suspicious retirement due to a loose fuel tank actually wasn't so suspicious. On lap 14, Campari pitted because his oil tank had started to come loose, which meant his engine wasn't getting lubricated. His mechanic tried to strap the oil tank back in place with a rope, but Campari was forced to pit 2 more times until a total lack of oil caused his engine to fail. He didn't retire in order to give Varzi or Nuvolari an advantage, as Neubauer claimed. In fact, he was desperate not to give them that advantage, and he destroyed his engine trying to stay on the track. If you recall from Neubauer's story, lap 14 was also when Birkin pitted. Capps verifies this claim, but he notes that no one at the time reported anything especially weird about the stop, other than Birkin burning his arm on the exhaust pipe. But it's also likely that that wasn't really a big deal, because that was a fairly standard injury during pit stops in those days. After Campari's first stop, Nuvolari swept into the lead, then pulled into the pits on lap 23. Most reports of that day indicate that a full stop was taking somewhere between 2 to 4 minutes, but Nuvolari essentially pulled a splash and dash. 20 seconds after coming to a full stop, he was back on the track with just a little extra fuel in his tank. Varzi had inherited the lead, and Nuvolari took off trying to catch him. For a moment, it even looked as if Nuvolari might actually beat his competitor when Varzi's Bugatti suddenly slowed, showing signs of fuel starvation. The reality was that he'd actually fitted his car with an additional fuel tank in order to avoid having to stop during the race, and the switch between the primary and secondary tanks had not gone smoothly. And yes, the addition of an extra tank was totally legal. The Tripoli event was run on Formula Libre regulations, which meant that there were no weight, engine, or other restrictions on the car. As Nuvolari watched his rival struggle, perhaps if the coin flip deal had happened, maybe he assumed that it was off, and he could launch into action. He sliced the gap between himself and Varzi, then took the lead on the penultimate lap. According to Canestrini, Varzi and Nuvolari were side by side, screaming at each other from their cockpits throughout most of those final 2 laps. But Varzi had the superior car. His Bugatti was able to both outbrake and out-accelerate Nuvolari's Alfa Romeo, and Varzi took advantage of that power in the final corner. Varzi ran Nuvolari wide, braked late, then shot into the lead. As the cars crossed the finish line, they were 0.2 seconds apart, and there was not one shred of suspicious evidence in sight. As for Birkin, it's still not entirely clear what happened to cause his health to deteriorate so rapidly. For years, many people thought that he just failed to treat his wound, which got infected and resulted in his death on June 22, 1933. However, as modern science has progressed, another possibility came to light. During the Great War, Birkin caught malaria while he was serving in the Middle East. Experts now posit that he suffered a relapse, perhaps even while he was in Libya. They believe he very well could have died of the disease even if he hadn't been burned, but that the burn paired with a weakened immune system was simply too much for Birkin's body. Further, there is no evidence that any driver specifically pushed for the strange rule that only one mechanic could work on one car during the race. Therefore, there's no blame to be assigned to anyone for Birkin's death. It was just a tragedy. The Tripoli Grand Prix ran until 1940. In 1935, German manufacturers competed in the race for the first time and secured 5 straight wins. One for Rudy Caracciola of Mercedes-Benz, one for Achille Varzi of Auto Union, and 3 in a row for Hermann Lang of Mercedes. In 1940, the only factory teams that turned up to the event were Alfa Romeo and Maserati. As a result, Giuseppe Farina won behind the wheel of his Alfa. After the onset of World War II, the race was never held again. The weird history of the 1933 Tripoli Grand Prix raises plenty of questions that don't really have tidy answers. The biggest question that will likely never be answered is why Alfred Neubauer would lie, and to lie so dramatically that he would dedicate an entire chapter of his autobiography to an event that not only didn't happen, but one that he didn't attend. Was his exaggerated story an attempt to besmirch the name of Italy's greatest competitors? Did he hope to right a perceived wrong? Was he simply relaying a fun story he had heard? We don't know, and we likely never will. But that also brings me to one of the biggest frustrations that every historian faces. Record keeping and fact checking in the past was a whole different beast than it is today. There are some facts in racing that are indisputable. When countless diverse sources confirm a race's finishing order, it can be safe to assume that that was how the race transpired. But when a writer issues an opinion piece or relates the details of a story that no one else ever told, how are we supposed to know what really happened? How many statements are definite fact, and how many are colorful reproductions of a half-remembered conversation? What did the author gain from telling the story? And would they have gained a little something extra by twisting a detail here or omitting one there? What interests did the author have? What goals? The nature of motorsport history is murky, sometimes intentionally and sometimes by accident. But here at Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, I intend to hold space for all those different interpretations of history and the challenges that those interpretations raise. After all, where's the fun in learning about history if it isn't a little mysterious? Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next show, we'll be looking into the shocking death of a 7-year-old boy in a racing accident that completely changed the scope of motorsport in America and directly led to the construction of some of this country's most celebrated racetracks. It is a death that has tragically been forgotten. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a great rating, and leave a review. Plus, if you're hungry for more, make sure to subscribe to the Deadly Passions Terrible Joys Patreon. Tiered patrons get exclusive access to weekly blog posts and newsletters, doing deep dives into big events, both past and present. Plus, if you want to send me an email, I have an address for that. Deadly Passions Terrible Joys, all one word, @gmail.com. Plus, do not forget to check out Home Field Apparel. Sign up for subscriptions. Let them know that you are interested. They have a handful of gorgeous motorsport merch drops coming all year long, and I promise you are not going to want to miss them. Finally, we are ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can find the full list in the episode description. This week, I want to give a huge shout out to Motorsport Magazine's incredible digital archive. This allowed me to quickly access race reports for all of the Tripoli Grand Prix, as well as the discourse that evolved around the 1933 event. These came from authors like Bill Body, Mark Hughes, Dennis Jenkinson, and Doug Nye. I also have to pay special recognition to Don Capps. It was his tedious research, his Atlas F1 article, and his regular insistence on setting the record straight via letters to Motorsport that has actually provided us with a challenge to Alfred Neubauer's once readily accepted narrative. Capps' push to set the record straight is a great reminder to all of us to dig a little bit deeper into all those racing stories that seem a little too sensational to be true.